If you've been to India, you'll notice thousands of Maruti Suzukis zipping hither and thither, Ubering people across town in air-conditioned comfort for less than the price of a mango lassi. But you'll also notice the occasional 1950s Morris Oxford and wonder, how did that get here? The Hindustan Ambassador, as the Morris Oxford is known there, is a story of Indian four-wheeled mobility in the 20th century, a car that was still being manufactured 14 years into the 21st century. Just why it lasted so long when there were better cars available is a fascinating story, and it may not be over yet. This is the Hindustan Ambassador story. The Oxford was Morris's first car in 1913, and successive versions kept the company busy up to the Second World War. But it was the post-war Morris Oxford that kicked production into high gear. Designed by Alec Izagonis, it was the larger brother to the Morris Minor, and both included advanced unibody construction techniques. Customers after the war were hungry for cars, and the Oxford sold almost 160,000 from 1948 to 1954. Over in India, the standard of living was rising, at least for the middle class, so during the war, Hindustan Motors was founded to produce cars in India instead of simply importing them. They had to wait until after the war to carry out these ambitions, though. With a century of British rule and with the British car industry dominating at the time, it was natural Hindustan thought to partner with a British company. But the turmoil of Indian independence in 1947 meant it would take until 1949 for the Morris 10 to roll off the production line as the Hindustan 10. By this time, Morris's new post-war cars had caught their eye, and soon the Morris Minor would appear as the baby Hindustan, as well as its bigger brother, the Morris Oxford, as the Hindustan 14. But Hindustan Motors, like a newly independent India, wasn't joined at the hip to Britain or British companies. The Chevrolet Deluxe would be produced and sold as the Hindustan Deluxe, but it was Morris's car that proved to be more successful. They were good value and, more importantly, able to stand up to Indian roads. So when Morris updated the Oxford to the Series 3 in 1957, Hindustan Motors leapt on the chance to buy up the old tooling for the Series 2 car and sell it as the new Hindustan Landmaster. The Landmaster would only remain in production for a short time. Much of the Series 3 was the same as the Series 2, so it was agreed to offer the Series 3 in India as the Hindustan Ambassador. This included the updated interior, but kept the older side valve engine from the Series 2 car. Production began in 1957. The new Ambassador seemed to epitomise a modern India, a reliable car that bridged the class divide. It was the Prime Minister's transport, as well as a popular car for taxi companies. At the same time, Hindustan's aircraft division was looking at a new lightweight and inexpensive car. The HAL Pingle, shown in 1960, used a fiberglass body and a two-stroke engine for the low price of 4,600 rupees, about £345. This was at a time when the new Morris Mini cost £500. It was an interesting idea, but never made it into production. By 1960, the Ambassador got the Morris Oxford Series 3's uprated 55 horsepower 1.5 litre B-Series engine. And by 1963, the Ambassador Mark II appeared. This time, Hindustan Motors didn't take the tooling for the next generation Morris Oxford, but just did a few tweaks to their existing car. It was much more cost-effective after all. The Mark I's elaborate grille gave way to a simpler affair, and the interior got an update. Although these were minor changes, a hungry Indian middle class snapped it up. To be honest, they didn't have much of a choice. A newly independent India was very cautious of outside investment. It had, after all, led to British rule in the first place through the East India Company. They embraced socialist principles. The word was added to the constitution, and the Indian economy had extensive regulation and protectionism. With Hindustan Motors as pretty much the only game in town, this meant if you wanted a car, all roads led to the Hindustan Ambassador. It would soon get a mammoth 70% market share in India. Hindustan Motors loved the economic conditions the government had created for them, and sales grew. But this virtual monopoly wouldn't last long. Fiat sold the tooling for the Fiat 1100 to Premier Automobiles, and in 1964 it was sold as the Premier Padmini. Triumph did a deal to produce the Herald in India. The Ambassador was finally getting some competition, and more modern competition at that. But both the Padmini and the Herald never made a big dent in the market. Indians preferred the rugged Ambassador. It was easy to repair, and spare parts were available up and down the country. By the early 1970s, Hindustan Motors produced the Ambassador Estate. Morris had produced an estate version of the Oxford known as the Traveller, but that was 15 years earlier, and plans were likely lost to time, so it's understandable that Hindustan Motors' version was significantly different. They also produced a van as the Ambassador Camionette, but both the van and the estate never caught on. The Ambassador had a good-sized boot or roof to hold luggage, and thanks to the steering column mounted shifter, it could seat 6 on the front and rear bench seats, or 15 at a push. This was India after all. The Mark III Ambassador arrived in 1975. The grille was again revised with separate indicators, and the interior got another tweak. There was a deluxe model with an improved dashboard. In 1977, the 1.5 litre Morris B series engine got enlarged to 1.8 litres to give enough power for the optional air conditioning system, a must in Indian summers, or so Hindustan Motors thought. Customers thought otherwise, and it was dropped in 1979. Hindustan Motors would also try its first exports to South America and Mauritius. Just 4 years after the Mark III appeared, the Mark IV Ambassador appeared in 1979. The front grille shrank and it got square indicators. The B-Series engine was converted to run on diesel, making it India's first diesel car. It was also 25% more expensive than the petrol version and reserved for government or taxi use, as India restricted private ownership of diesels. The Ambassador had been on sale for over 20 years, and Indians had taken the Ambi, as it was known, to heart. But it had hardly changed. Cars in the West had moved on immeasurably, but there was little incentive for Hindustan Motors to innovate with a closed market that protected Indian businesses. 20 years earlier, the new Ambassador had epitomised a new modern India full of hope. By 1979, it again epitomised an India stagnating under protectionist policies that kept the economy ticking over, but was being passed by other countries. More vehicles were needed on Indian roads to improve the economy, and the future wasn't in the old-fashioned cars Hindustan Motors were producing. Something had to be done. The Indian government opened up the economy to joint agreements between Indian and foreign companies. The government created the Maruti Company in 1981 to allow Suzuki to come in as a minor partner and bring its modern cars. At first, they were imported, but very quickly they were being produced locally. The first car to appear was the Suzuki Alto, badged as the Maruti 800. It was clear that for the price, the Maruti was a much better deal than the Ambassador, and the Maruti quickly became the top-selling car in India. Waiting lists grew to over 3 years. Ambassador sales suffered, of course. The government moved in to help the embattled Ambassador, some would say prop it up, making it the official car of state employees. Soon the government would have a fleet of 5,000 of them. Hindustan Motors had stagnated, and it's hard to get a stagnant company moving to compete against a new fast-moving upstart competitor. Suzuki's would be followed by Fords, Toyotas and Hyundais. Hindustan Motors had worked with General Motors since the 1940s, initially with the Hindustan Deluxe, but also with Bedford Trucks. In 1978, they bought the tooling for the Vauxhall Victor FE to sell as the Hindustan Contessa, launching it in 1983. It was a newer car and much more luxurious than the tiny Maruti, but it wasn't exactly modern. It was based on a 17-year-old platform and used the Ambassador's 30-year-old engine. The Ambassador soldiered on throughout the 1980s. More modern foreign cars appeared on Indian roads through additional joint agreements, and the Ambassador was looking increasingly out of touch. But it was increasingly becoming a symbol of India. This funny old-fashioned car seemed to be well suited to Indian roads and kept on going, a tribute to the Morris workers of the 1950s. It got another update in 1990 as the Ambassador Nova with an updated dashboard and steering wheel and better brakes. In 1982, Hindustan Motors had entered into an agreement with Isuzu to assemble the F-Series truck, and a byproduct of this agreement was access to Isuzu's car engines. The aging 55 horsepower B-Series in the Contessa was swapped out for the 86 horsepower 1.8 litre Isuzu engine with a 5-speed gearbox. By 1993, it was offered in the Ambassador, taking the top speed from 75 miles an hour to a scary 110 miles an hour. Probably not something to try with leaf spring suspension and drum brakes. Hindustan Motors had tried exporting the Ambassador since the mid-1970s. As it was an out-of-date car from the 1950s, they had to sell it on price. This was an increasingly hard prospect when modern cars were produced in vast quantities on modern production lines for a similar amount of money. The newer cars like the 1970s Yugo were beating it on price. So the Ambassador marketing team shifted focus. This car, now nearly 40 years old, was a nostalgic classic. It was imported back to the UK as the full-bore Mark X, hoping to appeal to those who remembered the original Morris Oxford or expatriate Indians who remembered the Ambassador. The thinking was if people were prepared to pay £14,000 on a reconditioned Morris Minor, they'd be happy to pay half of that for an Ambassador. Hindustan Motors fitted a heater for cold British mornings and seat belts to satisfy those regulatory safety nannies. Sales faltered with just 6 sold every year. It seems quality was a problem, so the importer took to rebuilding and respraying the cars to battle the ever-present problem of rust in damp Britain. But the changes and the higher price from all this extra work wasn't a hit, and the importers called it a day in 1998. While the Ambassador wasn't appealing to nostalgia abroad, Hindustan Motors thought it might do back home. So the Ambassador Classic was launched in 1998, along with traditional round front indicators from the 1970s Mark III model. The bench seat gave way to 2 individual front seats, along with power steering. There was a 2-litre Isuzu diesel engine, and it could be run from compressed natural gas. Hindustan Motors compared the Classic to the recent interest in the West with nostalgic cars like the new Volkswagen Beetle, Mini, and Chrysler's PT Cruiser. But these were updated versions of classic designs. The Ambassador was just the old model with a new lick of paint, and not many were fooled. Clearly, the Ambassador wasn't Hindustan Motors' future, with Indians zipping around the country in their new Maruti Suzukis. In 1994, a deal was done again with General Motors to produce the Vauxhall Opel Astra, but sales disappointed even when production switched to the smaller Corsa. Another deal was done with Mitsubishi to produce the Lancer and off-roading Pajero in 1998. That would eventually extend to include the Mitsubishi Outlander. These were modern high-end cars, something to keep the company going into the 21st century. The Ambassador platform had been converted as a light truck as the Porter, and in the late 1990s it was reused as a small bus called the RTV, and a utility vehicle known as the Trekker or Pushback. The Porter got an update as the Porter Plus. All these vehicles had the look of something thrown together on a very low budget, which they very likely were. The off-roading Pushback didn't even have an off-roading chassis. Hindustan Motors always accentuated the positives though. This meant this off-roader had a low centre of gravity for maximum balance. The Contessa ended production, but the Ambassador still sold modestly, selling 14,000 cars in 2002, so it got yet another small update, this time as the 2003 Ambassador Grand. The car got power front disc brakes, better air conditioning and interior, central locking and colour-coded bumpers. By now, private buyers had all but abandoned the Ambassador. 65% of all sales were as taxis and 16% went to the Indian government. A bigger update arrived the following year as the Ambassador Avigo. The front was retrofitted with slanting front lights and a new, simpler bonnet. The dashboard was completely updated with a modern retro look reminiscent of a cut-price Rover 75. It got luxury features like leather seats, a 6-speaker CD audio system, and air conditioning as standard. This wasn't your father's Hindustan Ambassador. This was a stopgap update though to maintain sales to taxi companies and the government, but Hindustan Motors' future, selling Mitsubishi cars, wasn't going so well. In their 2003 financial year, they sold 13,100 Ambassadors, but only 7,600 Mitsubishi Lancers from a network of just 40 dealers. The Ambassador celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2008. It was still the Indian Prime Minister's official car, but times were changing. Despite offering bulletproof versions, terror attacks in India spooked government ministers and many swapped to foreign imports. Hindustan Motors relaunched the Porter pickup as the Via in 2011 with an innovative feature that the cargo deck could be detached, presumably with its load, and the car driven separately. But time wasn't on the Ambassador's side. It didn't pass modern-day crash and emissions legislation in the West, and in pollution-hit India, 11 cities passed stricter emissions limits, effectively banning it. Hindustan Motors attempted to counteract it 2 years later with the Ambassador Encore, but it was all too little too late. With only 2,200 cars produced in 2013, production ended the following year. It had been produced for 56 years, the longest time a mass-produced car had been made on the same production line. It was the last in a long line of Morris Oxfords that had begun over 100 years earlier, and the last vestiges of that once great company. Mitsubishi sales had disappointed, and Hindustan Motors' debts were mounting up. In 2017, the Ambassador brand was sold to PSA, makers of Peugeots and Citroëns. That was ironic given Peugeot had featured an unhappy Ambassador owner who so wants a Peugeot 206 he uses unconventional methods to reshape his car. This allowed PSA an easier entry to the Indian market, should they choose, and in 2020, Indian website Overdrive published concepts they claimed had come from PSA and based on the Citroën C Elise. Time will tell if they're correct. Certainly, there's a lot of nostalgia for the Ambassador, both in India and abroad. Some of those cars imported into the UK in the 1990s are being used by Karma cabs. Ambassadors can still be seen the length and breadth of India. With India modernising, it no longer epitomises the country. It's a reminder of India's journey through the 20th century, from British rule to a modern republic. I've made an optional extra video that talks a little bit more about Hindustan Motors and the Ambassador, and there's a link if you're so inclined. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.